super excited to have you here from all over the world, which is awesome. Um, yeah, I was also surprised, Jason, to see you without facial hair, but so wonderful for you to join. Yeah, so just a little bit about me. So my name's Clint. I'm the head of security research at Semgrep. I also run the TLDRSec newsletter, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Jason Chan, who built and led the information security team at Netflix for over a decade. During that time, they were very prolific in sharing their knowledge in terms of tons of open source tools and conference talks, many of which I still go back to and like look at my notes because I'm like, oh yeah, this was some really good ideas. Previously, he led the security team at VMware before that. And I was actually looking on LinkedIn and I saw ISEC partners and At Stake as well. If you're not familiar, I feel like At Stake is kind of the OG security consulting firm from which, like, if you were to do like the heritage of all of the different things, I feel like that's the origin of like many very prominent people and who've gone on to found great companies and do awesome things. So yeah, very, very cool experience. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan was to talk a little bit about sort of time at VMware and sort of the culture there and kind of how that influenced your thinking. And then we can also get into time at Netflix, security principles, Paved Road, and stuff like that. But yeah, how does that sound? And we'll leave a bunch of time at the end for questions as well.
Let's do it. Thanks, Clint.
Well, cool. Yeah. So I guess I did a bit of your bio, but I guess what else is important that people should know about you? Um,
Oh, geez. Let's see. I still live here in the Bay Area. After retiring, I'm up in Marin County. I have three cats. I play guitar poorly. But other than that, I spend time volunteering for the Parks Department here in the food bank and also kind of coaching and mentoring folks that from underrepresented groups that want to either get into cybersecurity or sort of move their way up.
that's awesome. You also have very excellent dad jokes on LinkedIn. I would also like to point out,
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
which always seem like they're heading one way and then they sort of surprise you. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, all right. So you were the first executive to lead security at VMware. Can you tell me a little bit more about that role and how engineering and deployments at VMware worked at the time?
Yeah, I think I joined VMware in 2009, and I think probably the most interesting part of that role was my first day at work. I showed up and was kind of meeting everybody, and of course, I knew I was leading the security team and compliance, but they were, I also learned that first day that I also owned or was responsible for change management and release management. So, which was, I was familiar with those areas, but I wouldn't say expert. So I spent a lot of time digging into it, and yeah, it was, and also remember, so it was 2009. VMware was a really, really massive kind of monolith in terms of the application we were responsible for. Kind of Java, Oracle, all that kind of fun stuff from that era. And we did deployments. We did them once a month, and and they required downtime. So if you can imagine, like, it's hard to imagine now that sites would require downtime for for deployments or upgrades. But yeah, we would require downtime, and it was about sometimes 12 hours, sometimes 18 hours of downtime, and we would have like a 60. I mean, I had an amazing release management team, and they would put together like this 60 or 70-page Word document with all the steps, like manual steps, like stop this database, stop this server, run this script, a super manual. And we would require like probably about 50 people in the room at the same time. And we'd do these things on a Friday night going over into, Saturday morning. So it was a very, and I mean, that was just how things were done at that time, or in at least in a lot of places. And then, of course, when I went to Netflix, it was vastly different. It was, sort of in the nascent stages of moving to AWS and public cloud, and even then, in early 2011, the company was already doing, probably dozens of deployments a day. So it was kind of a night and day sort of transition.
Yeah, that is quite the difference. When you at VMware, was there motivation or drive to like automate some of those processes? Or you said like a 60-page manual run book of turn this off, turn this on. I'm just curious if they're, yeah, were they like gradually making progress in that? Obviously, if you're starting from scratch as a new company, that's easier. But yeah, I'm curious, like, were things headed in a specific direction towards automation or certain things over time, or was it just like, it's too much work, we can't do that?
No, I think there was commitment sort of to improve over time. But I would say another thing that was pretty influential was VMware was a pretty big ITIL shop. So, the IT infrastructure library, which is this kind of set of, I mean, it sort of looking back, it kind of feels heavyweight, but it's kind of a mechanism or a sort of group of processes and policies that sort of splits up how you deliver technology services. So like service management and incident management, request management, demand. So it's a very kind of structured. Um, I don't want to say bureaucratic because it sort of has the right has good intentions where you're trying to run things in a professional way with kind of known outcomes, with high availability, with decent security. So I think that was that was kind of a big part of the culture there. Like we even did, we did like weekly change management meetings where everybody get in a conference room and sort of talk about their proposed changes and their rollback plan. So, I mean, those things now, at least if you're working in kind of tech forward companies, all that probably seems pretty antiquated. But it's one of these things where people generally have good intentions and are trying to get the right things done. And the processes or the tools that we have available generally kind of shape the way we go about it.
Hmm, totally. So, yeah, what was it like going from that to a place that was already, when you joined, deploying 12, 20 times a day? Like, what was your first experience of that like?
Yeah, I mean, it was totally different. I mean, I was sort of a little familiar with public cloud at the time, but also, if you can kind of like, you know, sort of go back in a time machine and remember what things were like in 2011 in terms of public cloud. I mean, that was, and Netflix wasn't a startup at the time. I mean, it was a 14-year-old company. They'd been public for 10 years, so they were moving pretty much all into AWS and the public cloud from running in their own data center. And I think folks now, if you were going to say, if you were starting a new company, and of course you would think cloud first. That would be. I don't think most folks would question it. You choose your cloud provider and just go for it. But back then, it was pretty. It was unusual, even to some degree for startups, but certainly for larger public companies. I don't think anybody at the time was thinking all in on public cloud, and that's kind of where we were going and sort of the environment that I was dropped into. And I realized it was, I was kind of brought in to sort of think about cloud security. And again, this is a time before the cloud security industry really existed. And it was also at a time when the company was transitioning from basically being a DVD by mail company, with logistics and shipping around a lot of disks to doing online streaming. And that was also kind of a nascent business, and it wasn't clear that it would be successful or exactly how to do it. So there was, tons of innovation going on at the time. So I knew I wasn't going to be successful if I tried to say, hey, well, here's what I did at the last place. Let me just kind of replicate that here. So I was sort of trying to be tuned in with what the business needed, and it's also like what did the company culture dictate, and what did it want out of security, and that's kind of was my main inputs in terms of kind of figuring out how I wanted to structure things and go about things.
Yeah, that was one of the things you mentioned when we were chatting before this that I thought was such an important point of um, you were like, okay, we were getting into the streaming business, very competitive rate of shipping new things, super important to the health and long-term viability of the business. So you were like, okay, like it's my job to support the business and make sure that they can achieve their objectives as securely as possible. So I think that's sort of a refrain I hear from many different people who I would consider sort of like modern security teams, where they're like, cool, how do we help support and service the business rather than being like, hey, sorry, my needs are having this perfectly secure is more important than delivering new product features that might get us more business or help us against competitors and things like that. So yeah, just wanted to like, yeah, that really stood out to me.
Yeah, and I think what's worth mentioning, having kind of worked in security for quite a while before I joined Netflix. I think I'd probably been in the field for like 15 years already. And let's be honest, it's not like whatever we would call traditional security. It's not like we were being like wildly successful with like these old practices. So I think part of it for me was a recognition that for whatever was sort of written in the books that people were reading about kind of developing and operating secure software, it's not like we were, you know, hitting it out of the park, right? I didn't really view us as an industry being particularly successful. So, I mean, I was kind of open-minded and sort of optimistic that we could do things a different way. And that was kind of my starting point. I wasn't really, even though, I mean, and you mentioned at stake, and I spent almost 3 years consulting at Microsoft. During the kind of hardcore SDL and trustworthy computing days, and so I mean, I was kind of steeped in that kind of old school AppSec mentality. And like I said, I didn't. It's not that I thought that was valueless or a complete failure, but I was highly confident that those mechanisms were not at all appropriate for what I would consider modern software engineering practices. And this is modern at the time, 2011. So.
Yeah, along those lines, I was curious if you could tell me a bit about how you think of controls versus control objectives.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because and these they kind of sound like compliance terms or audit terms, regulatory terms, and they do have some foundations there. But I kind of think of the control objective is what's important, right? So just to use an example, like your control objective might be, you don't want to lose any data, right? That seems like a reasonable objective most companies are going to want to have. And your controls are, they're typically going to be like, well, we're going to make regular backups and we're going to test the restoration and we're going to do data integrity checks and things like that. And so when I kind of made the move from VMware to Netflix, I sort of would bear in mind, hey, even with this kind of like, older school, like ITIL approach, like control objectives are ultimately going to be the same, right? We want to run secure systems. We want them to be available. But your controls, that basically what you actually do to achieve those outcomes are going to vary. So, that was kind of key for me in terms of when we were building the team up and just kind of, communicating what we were doing, not just with, like leadership at Netflix, but also with our external auditors and, even internal auditors, because, at the time, like I mentioned, Netflix was already a public company. We had plenty of regulatory requirements, and we sort of had to commit to a bit of a kind of like an education initiative with our auditors to make sure that they understand, hey, how is the public cloud different? How are microservices different than sort of traditional applications? Why does it not make sense to have a firewall in the cloud? Those kinds of things. So there was, I would say, probably for like the first 3 or 4 years, a lot of those kinds of conversations to kind of explain to folks, whether they're internal or external, that hey, same objectives, like we're trying to meet the same goals. We're just going to have to go about it a different way.
Yeah, I like that. And I wonder if that framing makes it a bit more collaborative with engineering teams in terms of not like, hey, we need you to do X, but more, hey, we're trying to get outcome Y. Maybe what do you think is the most effective or most scalable or at least frictionful way for us to achieve that thing? And then it's sort of engineering and security at the same table, being like, okay, cool, this is what the business needs, not just what security team wants. And so it's maybe more collaborative framing is another thing it sounded like from what you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it was. I mean, hopefully my engineering peers at the time wouldn't disagree, but yeah, and I think a lot of that was driven by the Netflix culture, which was, very heavily about kind of focus and sort of like, ultimately we were trying to keep things simple, right? We're trying to create, a streaming product. We're trying to deliver a great service to customers. We're trying to make customers really happy, and everybody has a part to play in that. Whether you're building the personalization algorithm or providing device support or me trying to do security things, we're all kind of sort of trying to pull in the same direction. And I think honestly, I mean, that's really what it felt like most of my time there, is that everybody was on the same page. I always felt like I had really good support from my leadership, from my engineering partners to, to kind of figure out what was the right amount of investment, what were the right types of controls to implement. So yeah, I felt like it was super collaborative my whole time.
That's great. And yeah, culture is so key. Along those lines, I'm curious, could you share a bit about the core principles you and the team created for security at Netflix?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, kind of maybe echoing a bit of that last point. I think, first and foremost, and this is a topic I've debated a bunch with folks over the years, but so if you think about why companies move to the public cloud, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons, but I always loved the phrase that AWS would use about this idea of undifferentiated heavy lifting. This idea that to most companies, it's not differentiating to be able to run a data center or to manage storage or to manage a network. So our CEO really bought into that concept of this idea of let's focus on what differentiates us as a business, and like let's let other people handle the rest, right? So that's why we were so early to be all in on AWS, because it was this idea that, hey, we can build something that's never been built before, right? Like the subscription-based video service to let people watch all they want, no ads. But it hadn't been done. We needed to figure it out, and to be able to create the room to focus on that, we needed to be able to kind of let AWS handle compute and storage. So that was really my starting point in terms of principles for security. Is we really wanted to let, I mean, if you sort of use that approach and kind of face it internally, we wanted to let engineers focus on what they were hired to do. So you'll hear, sometimes some companies will say, "Hey, we want everybody to think security first. We want, security to be the number one priority for every engineer." And I have nothing against that kind of approach, but it was not at all how we thought about things at Netflix, and expressly because we were trying to create a business and something that hadn't existed. So we really wanted people to be able to focus on that. So if you're a great algorithms engineer or UI, it's like that's what we wanted you focusing on. Not just because that obviously engineers are expensive and they're hard to hire, but like they want to work on what they're specialists in. So I'm kind of I'm big into this idea of, I don't really want to make people responsible for something that they can't be, that they're going to have a hard time making kind of reasonable decisions in. And I don't expect folks to be security experts. Like, I expect them to kind of know how to get in touch with the security team and how to ask questions and sort of how to use the tools that we provide. But I don't wouldn't want them making decisions about complicated security things any more than they would want me making decisions in some field I'm not expert in. I mean, it doesn't. To me, that's what specialization and focus is all about. So that's kind of was our approach, and pretty much for my entire time there, and I was there for a little over a decade. I mean, that to me was kind of the through line of like, let's let people focus on what they were hired to do, rather than asking them to, handle 25 Jira tickets a week with a bunch of language they're not familiar with, and do a bunch of manual stuff, and make decisions and that they're just not prepared to make. So.
Yeah, totally agree. It does feel a bit unfair to me to be like, hey, we want you to be able to write high quality code very quickly, that's very performant, that delivers value to users. Oh, by the way, also, be security experts in this totally sort of adjacent domain that, we have spent years, decades developing understanding of sort of the nitty gritty details. So, yeah, totally agree. I haven't fully thought this through yet, but I almost wonder if there's sort of like a pyramid or like levels where it's like at one level it's like, okay, engineering is not thinking at all about security, and it's kind of a problem because it's easy for them to make lots of mistakes. And then maybe above that is they're very aware of security and like thinking about it, but they still have to do the right thing all the time. And sort of like above that, I don't know if it's like the galaxy brain meme where there's like different levels. Like I feel like one of the top levels is like engineers go back to largely not caring about security because it sort of happens around them because, to your point, it's built into the language framework platform libraries ecosystem that maybe at first they have to opt into, but then soon it's difficult for them to opt out of, and it just does the hard, undifferentiated heavy lifting without them having to do anything.
Yeah, I think that that's a great way to think about it. And I would say also, you know, a lot of the whole time it's always aspirational, right? You're always trying to like figure out how do you get, you know, make things slightly easier, you know, make things, you know, a little bit better integrated with the rest of the system, with the rest of the platform. But I think part of it is like you have to have that vision of how you want things to work so that folks understand when they're making decisions in their space, like what is the right way to kind of keep building towards this future. And yeah, to your point, and speaking of decisions, I remember somebody told me one time, and I don't know, for some, it was one of these quotes I always just kind of like latched onto. They basically said, you know, every chance to make a decision is a chance to make a wrong decision. So I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So that's kind of what I wanted to feel like we could sort of integrate with the overall program, the tools and the systems, you know, the paved road, all this kind of thing. Is we wanted to make it easy to do the right thing. And also, you know, like lower cognitive load, lower stress and anxiety about, hey, am I doing the right thing? So we wanted folks to just feel like, you know, don't worry about any of that stuff. Let us worry about it. And just basically like, you know, do whatever you're here to do and to kind of push the company in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely. There's sort of like two things I wanted to get into. So one is, let's say you are a security professional in a company and you're thinking like, okay, cool, I want to make security very easy for developers. Like, where do I start? What are like the high leverage places to start? And then also maybe the second part, how it can seem very aspirational to do these like maybe that might be non-trivial engineering projects in order to make this happen, and sort of like how that's kind of a continuum, and even though it's this great end state, like you can start small. So I don't know, do you want to start first on maybe thinking about how to prioritize?
Yeah, I think all those things are really key. And frankly, I think it's sometimes we as security professionals can have difficulty saying, oh, you know, I'm not going to do that thing that maybe I feel like we should do because you know you can never do everything. You're just never resourced to do everything. You don't have enough people, you don't have enough time. Like the business continues to change and grow around you. So for me, I think that's why it's important to have those strategic views, to have that strategic perspective of like, this is how we want the program to run. This is how we want our solutions to operate so that folks understand like we have a, you know, I always kind of think of that analogy where you sort of plant a flag on the mountain and like, and you might have a long way to go to get there and you might have to cross hills and streams and, you know, go over valleys, but you sort of keep in mind where you're trying to go. And yeah, and I think also when I've talked about this in the past, I think people they do kind of struggle with this idea of, well, you know, that sounds, you know, it's great, you know, you can do that at like a company like Netflix, or you know, well, we can't. It's hard for us to do that here, or you know, and yeah, it's like these things aren't easy. I think you know, like sort of thinking about a problem differently that's been done in kind of traditional ways for a long time. I mean, it's hard to sort of you know intentionally decide that you want to go a slightly different path, but you know, because I mean, I was at like my first year and a half or so at Netflix. I mean, I was an individual contributor, so it was just me. There wasn't really a team, and you know, I started to hire after that, so you know, had more the ability to do more. But I always would tell folks, it's like you can always start, and if you're trying to think of and maybe it helps to kind of just introduce like you know paved road a little bit more like a little bit more officially or formally. You know, the paved road, you'll sometimes hear it called, you know, golden path or well-lit path. And, you know, the sort of origin was part of that platform. At least the origin at Netflix was part of the platform engineering team, which I was a part of when I was hired. And it's this idea that, you know, you have central teams within engineering, whether they're doing security or observability or, you know, persistence, and, you know, they develop experience and expertise over time. They understand the kind of patterns and practices that are successful in kind of building and operating large scale distributed systems in the public cloud, right? So, and then the paved road was our way of kind of evangelizing for the adoption of these services. So they might be, you know, it might be, hey, here's our preferred way of doing persistence, or here's our preferred way of doing, you know, RPC, or here's our preferred way of doing, you know, key management. And we sort of present those as a paved road. And the idea is that, if you're trying to get from point A to point B in the physical world, well, you could choose to, sort of bushwhack your own trail through the forest. Or, there could be a paved road that maybe you'll get there a little bit smoother, a little bit faster because things are taken care of for you. But the idea is that you have a choice. Like you're not forced onto the paved road. Like it's not standards, or I mean, it's standards but not requirements. But that was kind of like I would say one of the overriding philosophies that we had as central teams. And there's always a little bit of tension, right? Because centralized teams, you're always a little bit behind where like the feature teams or the product teams are. Like they always kind of want you to be moving a little bit faster, but you have to support a big and diverse group of engineers. So yeah, that was the overall approach, and kind of getting back to your original question, I think you can always start somewhere. Some of these projects can be big. I mean, I know some of the paved road projects that we worked on in security at Netflix. I mean, they took multiple years to sort of design, to build, and to drive adoption throughout the engineering org because similar. I mean, these are big, complicated things, but also like the company is growing. There's more engineers, there's more systems, there's more services. You're kind of always migrating, right? There's kind of like a lot people will say like platform engineering. A lot of it is really about migration engineering because you're trying to get teams from legacy to current, and keeping an eye on future. So yeah, but yeah, I mean that's kind of what you sort of sign up for if your engineering organization is going to work in that style.
Yeah, one thing I think that's so interesting about that is it's not, at least based on how you described it, it's not this separate thing that security team is trying to get developers to do, but rather like you joined as part of the platform team. So the team trying to make the lives of other engineers better. And they're like, cool, let's like in this thing we're already recommending people to do, let's also just have some nice secure defaults there as well. So that it's not like opt into the whatever the platform engineering team says and whatever this other security team says. It's like, no, cool. These are actually just the same. Like this is the stack we're happy with. You don't have to do it. We're not going to force you. But look at all the nice wins you get if you do that. Um, yeah, and I think what I've heard from friends of mine at other companies is that it's nice when you have some secure by default library or infrastructure approach that makes things easy for developers. But I think like maybe Scott and Patrick and like Asha and other people were all like, hey, like, yes, you can have a great security experience, but what if the thing you're recommending developers to do actually has a better DevX than what they were doing before? Then it's like, why would you not do that? Like, it's like, hey, it's going to handle logging for you automatically. It's going to like, I don't know, make it more like distributed and fault tolerant. Like what are things engineers want and find useful, and like, can we provide that value as well as security wins? And then it's like, yeah, why would I not do that? There's like so much value here for the things I care about, and I get this nice security win too. So I think that's something that, at least from reading blog posts, watching talks, seems to have been a very effective approach of Netflix's security teams as well.
Yeah, I think yeah, and Scott and Isha, and they've all done great talks. I think there's some good blog posts on there from Julia and Patrick from the team as well. And I think one of the great examples about this was as Netflix started producing its own content, so like its own TV shows and its own movies and stand up. There, this studio sort of emerged, and the studio had all kinds of interesting challenges that they wanted to solve through technology. So we started getting all this demand for, hey, we need to get this app on the internet and this one on the internet, so that the people working on these shows could use them. And I remember asking somebody on the team, hey, we need to kind of think about paved road for internet facing systems. And he put together a guide, and I think it was, and I felt bad for him because it was like a 20-page Google Doc of like all the things you have to do to get a system on the public internet. And if you sort of think about it from the developer's perspective, they're focused on functionality, and then they're like, okay, we're ready to go. Now, like, let's get this thing on the internet. If they then need to traverse a 20-page Google Doc with a bunch of manual steps, like that's just, it's not a good experience, and it's not going to lead to great relationship between engineering teams and security teams. So that was something that we worked on a ton, and it sort of eventually, I think to your point, it ended in something that was quite simple, but also just really kind of superior from any perspective, whether it's the developer side or the security side, because it was basically like a pretty simple opt-in to a kind of an identity-enabled proxy that handled, all your normal kind of rate limiting and, authentication, authorization, all your logging and stuff like that. It was sort of, you don't have to worry about it because we'll just take care of it. All you need to do is sort of enroll in that and sort of opt in, and it's sort of managed for you. All your SSL certificates, all that kind of fun stuff. That's usually kind of a pain, and that sort of last minute stuff you're having to worry about it as a developer. So yeah, I think that was a great success story. But we were always looking for those kinds of things of like where can we improve security and the developer experience. But and then kind of like on the other end of that, if people are kind of wondering, hey, where do you get started? One of the and maybe this is just me kind of being a grumpy old person working in security for a while, but I always feel like, we always we have plenty of ways to kind of find things that people are doing wrong, like finding the next vulnerability or the next misconfiguration. But, it's really about like, how do we fix those things? So I was pretty adamant, especially early on, that I don't want to raise an issue to somebody if I don't also have an accompanying way where they can solve that problem. And kind of like, I would say the canonical sort of vuln type that we worked on at Netflix, that kind of fits that model was storing secrets in code, and of course, when you're using cloud, you're using external APIs, you need database connection strings, et cetera. There's a bunch of you need to have access to credentials and secrets at runtime. So people would store those in code, but originally we just didn't have a solution for doing that. So like, to me, it's not useful to say, hey, don't store secrets in code if you don't have a way. Okay, well, tell me how I should be doing it. So, when you start to get signal that, hey, this is a common problem that needs to be solved, rather than overloading people with findings they can't actually resolve, or they're going to try to self-resolve in some way that may not be appropriate or scalable. Like, let's just put our energy into, creating a mechanism for people to handle secrets, and then start evangelizing the adoption of those. And so that, it's kind of a timing thing of like, when are you going to raise findings? How are you going to think about engineering? How are you going to think about sort of driving adoption and migration?
Yeah, I totally agree with it's not very helpful and probably is even frustrating if you're like, hey, change this thing. And they're like, cool, you're the security expert. What should I do it to? And then you're not really helping with the fix. So yeah, I think making the fix as clear and easy as possible is certainly going to get broader adoption. But to going into the prioritization, so let's say you're dropped into a new company, you're parachuted in like some sort of fixing things awesome hero, and you see that yeah, there's like standard application security issues, maybe there's also some cloud issues, maybe um, the sort of internal identity story isn't totally locked down yet. Or I guess maybe more broadly, like what signals would you look for in terms of, like, let's say you're a very small security team responsible with securing the whole company, like where do you look and how do you prioritize out of the 50 things you could do? Like what would you do? Like where would you start? Like what's your decision criteria or function?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and honestly, I think that this topic is sort of it's kind of applies to anybody really at any size, because whether you're the first security hire at a small company, or you're one of several thousand in a large company, you're never going to have enough time to do everything you might want to do. So it's and I always thought that was my main job, especially as I moved into leadership roles, was to be able to communicate how do we think about prioritizing, and why are we doing this versus these other things. Because people always have opinions about, hey, we should be doing this or we should be doing that. So pretty early on at Netflix, I think it was like 2012, I kind of created a very sort of kind of customized, but and it ended up being pretty helpful for a number of years, just like a very simple way to quantify risk across the environment. So I think it's important, first, before you decide like what you're going to do, you have to understand like, how does the business work? Like, what is the culture of the business? Like, what's valuable to the business, and where can things happen that could potentially disrupt that? So I think it's important for you as a security person to understand that, like, well, what are we actually protecting here? And like, what could go wrong? Like, where are our dependencies? and then really use that to figure out, hey, these are the kind of risk scenarios I'm most concerned about. And then you start to think about, well, what are the projects, what are the controls, what are the interventions that I could implement that could reduce that risk to a level where I would feel comfortable about. And I mean, it's I don't know that I would have say that there are any, because a lot of that is judgment oriented and it's going to be based on your own experience. But I think one of the ways I would tend to recommend people think is that, there are certain controls that are really, they're sort of broadly applicable, right? That they apply to a bunch of different things. So, I mentioned things like secrets management. Like if you put in like a good mechanism for like managing kind of cryptography and handling keys, then you start to unlock a lot of higher level capabilities of what you can do with that infrastructure versus say like a much more narrow solution around, say, I don't know, some framework for mitigating cross-site scripting that's going to it's going to apply to sort of front end. So you sort of have to me, you kind of have to choose a little bit of your portfolio is going to be a little bit of each of those sets, like the kind of controls that are kind of broadly applicable. And maybe it's things like single sign-on or multi-factor authentication or, branch protection, whatever it might be, with the things that are going to be a little bit more narrow. And the things that I would say I would push on the more narrow side they're going to be the things that tend to apply to, your most critical assets, your crown jewels, things like that. So, an example of one of those things that we worked on fairly early at Netflix. This is probably 2014ish or so. Was around tokenization for the payment environment. So it's a solution that really only a few engineering teams are going to use, but you're using it to reduce the risk pretty significantly for your most sensitive data. But then other than that, you're going to go to the broader engineering organization with much more broadly applicable solutions, whether it's things like some of the stuff I mentioned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so part of it is you're just like, okay, understand the business context. What are the crown jewels or the most sensitive things that our company is protecting? Or maybe inversely, what would be worse for the company if this were to be in the news? Like my company hacked and this data stolen or this outcome, you're like, okay, that would be like the worst thing to happen to us. And then like, what security controls make that uh, as least likely as possible, perhaps. Um, one thing that I think is neat that I've picked up from a couple of blog posts and talks from the team is that there are definitely some specific sort of security solutions. Like, for example, you said like a front end encoding library for cross-site scripting is one example. But I think there's also certain classes of things that can it's almost like a fundamental capability that's valuable for many teams. So, for example, building a strong like asset inventory of this is the different services and this is what is currently running in our cloud environment. Obviously, useful for security teams because it's difficult to protect what you don't know is there or where it is. But it's also useful for maybe the different service teams to know, like, help troubleshoot their services. Maybe platform engineering team, it gives them visibility into where should we build more paved paths. It's maybe useful for the I don't know, team managing cloud costs. Like they're sort of, it's like the same like substrate that's providing value for security team, but also for like five other teams. And I think some of those projects can be maybe a little bit of work, but I think there's some like underlying capabilities, maybe like identity is another example where if you have like strong identity between services or employees or users of the app or things like that, like that's useful for security, but also useful for other teams as well. So I think like where are there cross org or cross team wins, I think is another cool approach that I've seen Netflix and other companies do.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And there was a question in chat around when did we start using this idea of paved road and like that name. And I think it's really important for like you as a security team. If you kind of think of yourself, you're a central team, just like there are platform team is a central team, and say the persistence team is a central team, and developer productivity, observability, etc. And To the extent that you are able to kind of harmonize the approaches that those teams use and also the technologies, you're going to make everybody's life easier because the thing that what you don't want have happening, and I'm not going to say this never happened at Netflix because it certainly did, is that the sort of product teams or the service teams, they kind of feel like they're just getting bombarded with like, oh, well, the platform team needs me to upgrade this, and the security team needs me to do this, and the observability team needs this, and the cloud cost team needs that. So you really need to think about that. Like, how are you going to prioritize collectively across that broad base? Because these service teams only have so much bandwidth to spend on these kind of I hate to call it tech debt, but it's kind of like more of the infrastructure bits, the kind of common bits, and we were always looking to minimize that and kind of sync with our other teams. Like I said, I'm not going to say that we were 100% successful there, but I think it is super important to recognize like security is not special in this area. Like we need to be operating in ways similar to these other centralized engineering teams are, because again, what you're really trying to focus on is how do I let the developer do their thing for as much of their time as possible. And there's so many different strategies you can pursue. And you mentioned on the tech side, yeah, that's I did some talks a number of years ago about like how should you think about like dual purposing a lot of tools, especially in the developer productivity space, for both, obviously what their kind of core intent is, but then also these kind of latent features they offer you for compliance and security. Like because that's one of the nice things about cloud is that everything when you talk about asset inventory, and asset inventory in the data center days was very, very challenging because things would just hide. And I would say like in the cloud, it's like, well, it's kind of hard to hide things in the cloud because you can run a couple API calls and you know what's there. But then a lot of your energy then is like, how do I kind of provide enough context so that I understand, well, what is the team that runs this application and where is their source code kept and their artifacts and their configuration, so that you can not only influence them for more proactive things, but also if something happens, if there's a large scale vulnerability or there's an incident, that you can sort of get to those folks as quickly as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So there was a number of questions. Some of them are on sort of the same topic. So let me read you a couple of them because I think they're in kind of like the same, asking sort of the same question. I think there's like two or three on this. So Dave asks, while not expecting them to be security experts, would you want developers to be security aware? And then how do you scale the program and support? Let's see, a related question. A couple people, Martin and someone anonymous, like on the point around engineers not having to focus on security. Is it an all or nothing thing? Does it make sense to adjust your approach on a team by team basis versus a centralized approach for partnering with engineering and product? And yeah, I guess another question also related, just like, is there some minimum or sufficient competency you expect from engineers knowing about security? Or maybe just knowing when to raise their hand. So yeah, I guess all these questions are sort of like, what is fair and reasonable to expect of engineers and things like that.
Yeah, I think this is such a great topic, and I think you sort of have to choose, based on your own company culture and kind of engineering skill and like how many resources you have. But I think trying to get back to that idea of like, well, what is this kind of strategic principle that you're trying to align towards? And I would say, and this is, I'll steal this from, Dan Gear, and, he would say, you want security to have these two qualities, right? You want it to be invisible and unavoidable. So that's kind of how I think philosophically I would approach it. And I mean, I would say, I think this maybe kind of gets to that topic of like not every company is going to have the same problem, but at Netflix it was the company had kind of bet its business that streaming was kind of the future, and that was like the prime everything. Like everybody was driven by that, so we had to figure out like how can we kind of do a lot of inventing and innovating, and you're going to make mistakes in kind of like this infrastructure that not a lot of people know about, public cloud, and sort of ultimately with the idea of you want the business to be successful. So I really, um, I mean, I think it's important for security teams and engineering teams to have good relationships, but and this is nothing new. I mean, I've been talking about this for quite a while, but I think you really, really, if you really want to scale, you have to look at the the interfaces you have that require humans, and you have to find ways to remove those. And like there's this saying, like nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM, right? Because they're kind of like the old traditional. I would say like in AppSec, no one ever gets fired for doing more threat modeling or doing more developer security training because it just kind of feels good, right? And it's what we know, and we've been trained to do that. But like those things, like they just don't scale when you're talking about like really, really, fast growing companies and, fast growing infrastructure. So you really have to find ways where you can like, let me rely less on a human interpreting something and get those things, moved over to like, what are the things I can automatically observe and then sort of drive my decision making based off of that. But I would say it's like I think part of it is you kind of have to figure out like what are you actually aiming to achieve, and then use that to kind of drive how your interactions are going to be with your engineering teams. Like, are you going to have a champions program or a partner program? Are you going to do things like threat modeling and secure coding training? Because to me, I think those are there's like there's 1,000 different ways, 1,000 things you might do if you wanted to kind of improve software security. You're only ever going to be able to do probably 10 of those things. So you have to figure out, well, how are you going to choose those 10 things, and are those 10 things going to be aligned with the company culture and the tech stack that you've chosen, as well as the engineering environment and the staffing that you have.
Yeah, I think obviously developer education and training and brown bags and things like that is very helpful, but if the ratio of security team to engineering is like 1 to 100, 1 to 200, yeah, that can be difficult to scale. And then also like it might just uh, like you might take a training one day and you're like, cool, like I get this, but then you have the other 364 days a year, which you're like not just thinking strictly from security point of view. Yeah, I like your point
Yeah,
on what are the things we can automatically measure in terms of like, is this dangerous? Is this not dangerous? And then maybe even programmatically fix or warn or things like that, that is sort of removing the human from the loop, or at least not relying on their judgment to be consistent and secure.
yeah, maybe it's like another way to kind of to think about that question that folks had about in terms of like what is the right level of investment for the relationship between developers and security teams, or like how much expertise do they need? I'm one of the kind of stats or metrics I was really kind of influenced by reasonably early at Netflix was this idea that the average developer tenure at a tech company like in the Valley was about 18 months. So if you think about it, your company has about 18 months of this person's time for them to deliver value in the business's best interest. So if that's the case, right, you got 18 months. How much of that 18 months do you want that person thinking about security? And my answer would be zero, if possible. Like I want them to know how to get in touch, or if they have a question, like certainly, like, and we had Slack channels and things like that. And I put a lot of energy into making sure that people felt comfortable coming to security teams, because I think that's one of the bigger barriers is that everybody has had a relationship. Like every engineer has worked somewhere else before, and they probably had a relationship with another security team. And many times that relationship wasn't particularly positive. So I kept that in mind of like, people they're always going to be a little bit wary working with security folks because they've probably had bad experiences before. So, I mean, I wanted folks to feel really comfortable coming to me directly, coming to anybody on my team, being able to ask questions. But I didn't want them, worrying about when they're actually, sort of building and operating to be worrying about security.
Agreed. Yeah, having that positive dynamic and having people be like, oh yeah, like security team is here to help me. I love coming to them with questions because they're always super helpful and friendly, and they're not just like, you can't do that and sort of grumpy. So I really like this question. It's about I guess having a lack of uniformity in tech stack. So question is, my assumption for a successful paved path program requires some uniformity and standards across the company. So if your company has, say, a bunch of microservices and multi-cloud and varied frameworks, programming languages, and things like that, it seems like a challenge enforcing a paved path program in terms of just the scale and fragmentation. So how would you approach a paved path if you're building it from scratch during sort of modern dev times? So multi-cloud, maybe 5 to 10 programming languages, different web frameworks, different everything.
Yeah, I mean, we had a ton of variety. I think kind of the key here to sort of note about paved road, and I noticed the person asking the question used this word enforcing. Like that's you don't enforce a paved road. You create the paved road, and then what you are trying to do is give people a better way of getting to their destination. But it's not forced. So I think that's the key. Because if you're a company culture where you just make everybody use this framework or use this language, then paved road is not that's not a thing. Then you just have standards and requirements. So paved road, I think it was important, especially in kind of those early days, because we were kind of figuring these things out as we went. Like we didn't like how do you do multi-regional persistence in AWS? Like there's no product for that, so you had to kind of build. So we were always recognizing that how to solve these problems could change over time. So the paved road evolves, and the idea is that by preserving that optionality, you're basically letting teams. So you're letting the team that has the best context because they're closest to the problem figure out whether or not the paved road is what they need, or if they should sort of divert and sort of do that bushwhacking and that kind of pioneering. But when you're working in a really kind of like I wouldn't say undiscovered, but it was kind of more of a nascent space. This idea of running distributed systems in the public cloud. It's like yeah, you're still kind of figuring it out. So that paved road will change. But I think the key there is like you don't enforce the paved road. Like the paved road exists, and I think if you sort of do it right in terms of you build solutions that people want to use and they solve the right kind of problems and you can kind of advocate for them and you support them properly, people will use the paved road. There's always going to be folks that will diverge a little bit, but I think at least in the Netflix culture, like you were free to kind of diverge from the paved road, but then you became responsible for whatever those things were that the paved road option solved. So it eventually, especially as solutions became more mature, it kind of becomes a bit of a no-brainer. Like, yeah, why wouldn't you want to use the paved road? But it wasn't forced. So I think that's kind of the key bit to take away there.
Yeah, and I think one point I heard in I think one talk that I thought was very clever is it's almost like taking a product mindset to what you're if you're building this paved path, where it's like the first thing you build may not be actually quite the right solution, and what you have to do is actually get feedback from the engineers using it to sort of iterate on it, almost like your company iterates on the product to fulfill user needs. Similarly, you're iterating to fulfill engineer needs. So the first attempt may not be perfectly right. It's sort of an iterative process. Um, yeah, along those lines, so you said not enforcing, but more encouraging. Dave asks, like, what do you think about nudging in terms of deliberately making the less preferred path awkward or unpleasant to direct them to the correct path?
Yeah, I think there's kind of this general idea that you can kind of do both of those things, or you can make the easy way easier, you can make the less preferred way a little bit harder. I think that's probably fine. But I think it's if I felt like there was a less preferred path that people were still taking, I would want to know why. I would want to know, is there something like that's why I would like when we talk about metrics and measurement, I would always want to know like what are the teams in the orgs that have high adoption of paved road versus low adoption? Because the low adoption doesn't mean that oh well, maybe they haven't heard about it, or maybe like your solution doesn't actually work. So I mean I try to be open-minded about that and really because again, you're always limited in time. I would prefer just to like let me just keep making the right or this. I wouldn't say the right is probably the wrong word because there's always more than one way to solve something. But how do I make the sort of preferred supported solution more attractive to a broader set of users versus because there's always going to be alternatives, and I would hate to kind of come to too quick a judgment on those because I would want to know well, why are folks using those, and maybe it is a better way.
Yeah, and that could be a good learning opportunity to make whatever you built better. And I like what you said about metrics and visibility. So if you have built certain security controls or primitives that some teams are using, some teams are not using, being able to continuously programmatically measure like who's using it, what is the adoption rate, does it vary by team, by org? I think Scott and Isha maybe had a AppSec Cali talk a few years ago that was like, hey, we actually have data for, of the teams that have adopted these controls, they had this many fewer bug bounty submissions of this lowering severity, which actually saved the business like this amount of money. So I think having like the metrics, because it's nice to build security things and feel like, yeah, we did it. This is great. But in terms of like actually measuring outcomes in terms of adoption, actual risk mitigated, and things like that is another key part, which I like that you emphasized.
Yeah, I think that's the key is, and that was one of the nice things about being someplace for so long is you can kind of see what works and what doesn't work. And yeah, I was always key on. I mean, I think things like vulnerability remediation. Yeah, those are just things you have to be good at, and you have to measure those. But I was always more keen on like let's measure adoption, and to your point, like let's see how these teams perform. But we would even look at things like our Slack channel, right? Who's coming to the Slack channel and what teams are coming to the Slack channel and how long, what questions are they asking? How many replies on that thread does it take for them to solve? Like, what's their recontact rate? So your kind of traditional customer service metrics, because you wanted to see, well, I mean, are these teams that are having a bunch of questions, are they actually are they enrolling and adopting the solutions that we provided? Because then that can kind of give me a hint of like, well, hey, maybe I need to go, introduce myself to this team's leader just so that they know, hey, we're here to help. We have this kind of set of things. I'd like to know more about maybe why your team has low adoption. Is there a problem there? So yeah, I think that to me was always much more interesting than thinking about vulnerability metrics. Are who is using the solutions we provided? Are they having better outcomes? Who's not using them? Why are they not using them? And then if, you're always trying to drive broader adoption, but then same thing in terms of where to start. Well, you start with the first thing. You start measuring adoption and outcomes, and then you just kind of add to that. And over time, I think you can build up a pretty good kind of like set of metrics and that you can use.
Oh, yeah. So Jason and I can both keep going for a few minutes to keep answering questions. So yeah, feel free to stick around if you'd like. Otherwise, thanks so much for your time. So one, just quickly wanted to go back to something you said before, because I found it really insightful when we were chatting before this about sort of paved road being a continuum. And I think a lot of people hear that and they're like, oh, cool. Like it would be great if I had a bunch of engineers that I could like build this thing over a long period of time. But you said like, okay, well, maybe it starts as like a Google Doc, which is like, here's all the steps to bring something to internet facing. And then from there, maybe you automate parts of it. Then maybe you build some tooling or infrastructure that is sort of opt in. And then eventually, maybe that's a part of the framework and it's on by default unless you opt out of it. So I don't know. Do you have any more um, thoughts or context about sort of this paved road being a continuum and how it can be approachable and feasible for companies, even if without maybe the engineering culture or team size of, say, like a Netflix?
Yeah, I think I think you captured it really well there. I think of it really about like this kind of two-dimensional matrix where you have kind of the breadth, like how broad or how wide is the paved road, meaning like how many different problem areas are you addressing, and then how deep or maybe how the depth would be like the maturity of those individual solutions. So you mentioned maybe you start off your paved road for how to do something is just a Google Doc that has some steps, and maybe the next one is, hey, run this script and do these other manuals, and then eventually it becomes ingrained. So I think that's a good way to think about it is like how broad do you want it to be? How many different areas do you want to cover? And then to what level do you want each of those solutions integrated? And then you can kind of use that as like a maturity matrix and sort of kind of like a planning mechanism. Yeah, I think in terms of like, is paved road appropriate for every culture? Like, can you do it with a small team? I mean, I would say, I think, I mean, I think yes, you can do it as a small team. I mean, I was doing it with just myself for the first couple of years, so I think that's totally reasonable. And don't feel like, because the paved road, it might be really narrow at the beginning, and it might have some gaps, so that you're going to have to hit some dirt. So I just think of it over time, like in the fullness of time, you want to be able to develop kind of like this robust mechanism. But I think, getting back to that earlier point, I mean, if you're in a culture where there is not a lot of kind of freedom for individual developers to kind of choose their own path, then paved road is probably not appropriate because you're talking about a culture where the standards and the practices are kind of mandated or dictated. And I'm not saying that as like that's a lesser way of doing things. I think it's totally appropriate based on size and maturity, how regulated you are, like how novel the problems are you're trying to solve. So I think paved road is probably more appropriate for like faster moving, higher growth environments where you have engineers that have a fair amount of autonomy in terms of choosing how they can solve a particular problem. So that to me would be where paved road is probably a little bit more applicable. I think if you talk about a more kind of like structured, mature, kind of like top down type of environment, then your paved road is probably more. You might still kind of approach it the same way in terms of evaluating adoption and sort of tracking those kinds of things, but it's sort of your approach to evangelizing is probably going to be slightly different.
Hmm. That makes sense. There's a couple of questions about um, like actually building the paved roads around, is the security team building them? Are they partnering with the platform teams to get them built? Sort of more tactically, how are they getting built?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both of those. So we would build solutions. We would partner with platform engineering teams to build into the products that they were building. We a lot of times we would integrate because again, I think what you're trying to do with things like paved road or platform teams broadly is you're trying to kind of reduce the cognitive load that developers have, or you're trying to make it easier for developers to get an idea out of their brain and into production. So you can pursue a bunch of different strategies for that. One of them is this idea of platform engineering and paved road. So we would always, I think it's important that you're working with your peers because you want it to be a consistent experience. You don't want it to feel like, oh, well, this solution from security, we do it this way, but then this solution that we get from the observability team is slightly different. So you do have to invest in both of those. Like you're going to build a lot of your own solutions, but they may get packaged or delivered through platform engineering or through your whatever system you use to deliver or orchestrate.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that was very interesting is just chatting with some people on the Netflix AppSec team. I think it was sort of like a combination, or it evolved over time to be some people super strong security SMEs, and also just hiring some like software engineers who are interested in security. And then it was sort of like having the talent in-house where you could have the security SMEs be like, okay, cool, what is high leverage for us to build? And then having people who are excellent at writing software like actually build those things. Because at least for me as a security professional, I can write code, but it's not certainly my strength compared to someone who's professionally a software engineer. So I thought, and I've actually seen another couple of companies where the AppSec team is hiring some software engineers. I think Segment was doing that maybe as well, and a few others. But yeah, I think that's an interesting approach where rather than relying on another team, you're like, oh, our security team, or at least part of it's like a security engineering team where there are some software engineers. So I thought that was an interesting shift that I think was not the case maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, totally. I think I think it's a healthy trend for security teams to be hiring software engineers. And yeah, I mean, I would say my experience has been, and this was even kind of consulting wise, like it's easier to turn a software engineer into like having some security expertise than it is to take like a security person into a software engineer. So yeah, we always have a balance of that. And then we had a lot of, full-time security folks who were, quite good, professional software engineers, and they would build. And then we also hired, and I think part of it is sort of like a bit of timing. Like once you've sort of built up like a reasonable amount of security expertise, then you can probably support having just really solid software engineers who are maybe not security experts because they're going to be able to lean on their teammates. Like those are probably not going to be your first hires in a security team. You're probably going to hire folks that are a little bit more generalist skill wise and who can do software engineering, but are maybe not they're not doing it full time. So, but yeah, I think it's a healthy trend. I think when we for better or worse we kind of had to build a lot of stuff on our own because the industry just wasn't particularly mature. But even now, I think as you see, the cloud security industry has become much more mature, but you still need to be able to integrate these systems and kind of write plumbing and kind of connectors and, handle data. So I still think that, from here on out, you're going to see software engineering skills directly embedded into security teams. Because I just personally haven't seen it work well where you have to rely on some kind of external resource to build the stuff that you want. I don't know that that's like, just with all your kind of incentives and planning and prioritization. I think to some degree you want to be able to kind of own those resources directly. Not to like build empires or anything, but just to be able to better manage your outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's do last question. I think a little bit more tactical. And you've touched on this a little bit before, but I wonder if you have any like maybe explicit, concrete advice you want to give beyond what you've already shared. So what's the best way to come up with these paved roads? So some things that I've heard, for example, like using maybe like prior pen test or bug bounty results in terms of like what sort of security issues have we had in the past that have been critical to your earlier point, like looking at your business, like what is our crown jewels and figuring out what are the security controls that mitigate that. Um, I don't know. I'd say like anecdotally, there's some things that are harder or that have more sharp edges for developers in terms of like parsing XML or crypto or authentication or authorization, maybe cross-site scripting or common web vulns. But yeah, I'm curious, like, uh, yeah, maybe tactically, or if there's maybe a top three things that you're like, every company should do this first. And like, if you haven't done this, like, maybe start there. So sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah, no, and of course, it always depends. But yeah, I would say I personally would take the approach of, yes, there are going to be these gnarly problems that may take like a year or two to solve. I don't know that I would start there, even if they're going to have like a lot of payoff. I would want to. I'm just a fan of like, let's start small, like let's see if it works and kind of get some momentum, kind of like this snowball effect. So I would personally look at things like, what are some, fairly small things that we can look at that we feel like, hey, we have a way of solving this problem and of kind of evangelizing the problem, and then also measuring like whether or not it's happening. And I think some easy examples that I would think of from like what we did at Netflix were, like in, I mean, if you're familiar with AWS and you remember, you used to have to use these static IAM credentials that never kind of rotated, and then they eventually moved to this construct called on instance profiles and IAM roles. So, we would advocate for folks to be using an application specific AWS IAM identity, and that was pretty easy to test and sort of check. And then you could say, these are the folks that are doing it; these are the folks that are not doing it. You could do things like another thing that we worked on fairly early was we wanted to have a limited and kind of approved set of certificate authorities that people were using for SSL certificates. So things like that are they're small enough, they're kind of achievable. It's like, okay, I can kind of create some tooling around checking these things. That the SSL issue we eventually built into a system that we open sourced called Lemur that sort of kind of took over management and monitoring for us. But I think about those like smaller things, but then kind of keeping in mind, how are we going to approach these larger kind of gnarlier problems that might be kind of multi-year things. But I think if you sort of, even if you took those two examples that I kind of carved off, then you start having like this set of things that, and we would kind of call this construct like security production ready, or just generally production ready. These set of things that, like, these are the way that we would sort of approve of or kind of support these things being done. Now let's go out and check to see whether or not teams are doing these and whether systems are adopting these kinds of things. So, and I think you just kind of get additive from there. You got to start somewhere. So I mean, I'm always a fan of starting small and kind of going from there. That's just the way my brain works.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense to me. Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I feel like I've learned so much from you and the Netflix team over the years, so really appreciate it. Yeah, any where should people find you, or any parting words that you'd like to share? And thank you, everyone. who joined.
Yes, thank you for joining. I would say also thank you for acknowledging the team, because like I was just, I was just one person. I was lucky to have an amazing team, just super sharp and talented folks that I got to work with for many years. In terms of where to find me, if you don't mind bad jokes, then LinkedIn. I would say Twitter, but I think
Excellent
I'm
jokes.
kind of like on that less and less and less. But yeah, I'm always happy to connect on LinkedIn and kind of chat from there.
Cool. Well, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your week, and take care.